Welcome to the Be Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Hello and greetings from sunny and absolutely beautiful Seattle. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Be Bold podcast. I'm home for just a few weeks before heading off on our Santa Fe culinary tour in June. And right after that, I've got a trip to New York City and New Jersey. And while there, I'm going to be recording some podcast episodes with some pretty cool ladies. And I'll also be visiting some pretty cool family as well. My family's there. Before I leave, though, I've got a group of women joining me in just about a week and a half here in Seattle for our Seattle culinary tour. And that means I get to visit my very favorite haunts. I get to take part in activities that are in my own backyard. And fantastically enough, I have the privilege of showing others around our city. And the amazing thing, it's been unusually warm here. And I'm just hoping that it holds out for the summer because me likes me some warm weather. And I hope it holds out for our group too. I suspect that it will. Okay, today is an Ask Me Anything episode. I get a lot of emails from people, and in the course of my tours and my speaking gigs, I also get a lot of questions that get asked of me about a lot of different things. And I thought it would be interesting for listeners to hear answers to these questions. So occasionally, starting with this episode, I will add an episode like this to do just that. Ask me anything. If you didn't have a chance to submit a question, the best way to reach me is through the contact form on the BeBoldPodcast.com website, or you can find me on Facebook. You can friend me there, or you can join the Be Bold Facebook group and leave a comment. Now, the questions that came in covered a wide variety of topics, and that includes travel, of course, entrepreneurship, running, staying motivated, as well as Buddhism and my meditation practice. And I don't think I can get to all the questions today, so I'm going to save some of those for another time, but here goes. We're going to give this a shot. I want to start with a question from Robin, because her question, or some variation of it, is the number one question that I get via email. Now, this pertains to something that many of you may not know about me. It's a very unique thing. People who are interested in it tend to find me online, and then they pepper me with questions. And it's something, and I'll get to what it is in just a minute. It's something that I don't think I'm a record holder in or anything, but it's unique enough that you're pretty hard pressed to find other people who've done this thing, and especially women. Now, there might be one other woman who's done this, but I don't know who she is. So if you do, please let me know. So what is it? What is it? I know you're asking. In 1997, I rode a BMW 650 motorcycle solo from Seattle to Panama. And that's Panama, the country, not Panama City, Florida. The trip was 7,000 miles over 9 weeks. Now, before that trip, I had people tell me, probably something similar to what you're thinking to yourself right now. I had people tell me that I was going to die, that I'd be raped, arrested, left in a ditch. They'd get a call that I was in jail, or they were just sure the bike would be stolen. But I knew really deep down that if I treated people well, that they were going to treat me well in return. And that is exactly what happened. The trip was one way, and I like to say it's because I'm not crazy. I wouldn't come back and do the whole thing in reverse. But the trip was one way, and once I got to Panama, I had the bike packed up and I had it shipped home back to Seattle, and then I flew back. Now, let me give you a little backstory on that trip before I get to Robin's question, just so you have some context around this. So I knew I wanted to ride my motorcycle on a long trip, and I also knew that I didn't want to have to ship the bike to start the trip. So in other words, I didn't want to ship the bike to like Europe and then travel around there. The most logical thing would have been for me to just travel around the US and Canada. But honestly, that didn't hold a lot of appeal to me. I really wanted something that was more of an adventure. And I remembered a conversation that I had with a New Zealander, a guy who I had met in New Orleans. And he said he had visited the U.S., rented a motorcycle, and he wanted to ride to Panama. But instead of going to Panama, the country, he landed in Panama City, Florida, and he was in a bit of shock. Yeah, I know. It was kind of dumb on his part, but I guess maybe in a little bit of his defense, I think a lot of Americans probably couldn't find the South Island of New Zealand. But yeah, he ended up in the wrong spot. Anyway, when I thought about going on a motorcycle trip, I thought about that and figured, why not give this a shot myself? Now, my grandfather, as far as I had learned, had worked on the Panama Canal. So I thought it would be really cool to see the canal, and then maybe I could find his name somewhere, like in the record books. I had no idea what I was going to be looking for, if there were even any record books there. It turns out there weren't, and everything is online now. So it was a little bit fruitless in terms of that, but it was still pretty cool. Now, the problem with my idea of going to Panama on a motorcycle was that I didn't have an appropriate bike for that trip. At the time, I owned a 450 Honda Rebel, and that's a little bike. If you know anything about bikes, it's pretty small. It's very much roadworthy, but it's wrong in so many ways for a big trip. Definitely not for distances, and definitely not for the kind of speed I would need on the highways. Now, not that the highways in Central America are any great highways. Like, really only in Mexico are you able to go fast. But I knew kind of going through the U.S., I wouldn't want to be on the highways trying to do 60, 65 on that little bike. And in addition to that, there was no way I could outfit the bike for the trip. There was just no way that all of my stuff for a couple of months trip would fit on there. So what I did was I started putting out feelers to see if I could get a motorcycle company to sponsor me. The people I reached out to were really nice, and they were interested in helping me. But honestly, in retrospect, I look back and I think, they probably never thought that I would do it, so they were just kind of placating me. But hey, it landed up in a good spot for me. Anyway, one person led me to another person who led me to another person, and finally, there was a woman I met who led me to Craig Hansen at Hansen's BMW, which is located down in Medford, Oregon. Now, Craig was supportive of my idea, and he knew that BMW was coming out with a motorcycle, and that was the 650 Funduro. Now, this motorcycle was being marketed to women, and it was the first time that BMW had really kind of put this energy into the female market. The bike is a little smaller than other BMWs, and it's meant as an on- and off-road bike, and that would be just perfect for my trip. So really, it was Craig who was instrumental in connecting me with the home office of BMW and helping me present my case and working with me to create a sponsorship pitch, which ultimately led me to a loaner bike from BMW and a bunch of gear from them. Now, I will say there was one point when Craig and this mutual friend that we had that initially connected us, there was this point when both of them called me and said, hey, we're pulling out of supporting you because we don't think that you have the riding experience to do this trip. And at the time, I remember being relatively unfazed by this concern. See, I knew that I could do it, and there was no stopping me. And I was so confident that I told them I was just going to do it anyway, with or without their blessing. And really, that was enough, I think, to increase their confidence and then back me, because they turned around and said, okay, we'll back you on this. So I had the bike and the gear. I mapped the route that would lead me out of Seattle, down through Oregon, into Craig's shop in Medford, where he'd do any final tweaks and help me out with any additional gear that I might need. And I did, it turns out. And then from there, I went down the coast of California into Arizona and New Mexico, where I actually stayed with Robin. And now she's the one who asked this question to begin with, and I'll get to her question in a minute. So I stayed with her in New Mexico. I went on to Texas. Now, I had been told that the border crossing into Mexico from Texas was actually easier than any other border crossing. And that would be important for me because I didn't own the bike. So I had kind of this paperwork that allowed me to travel with it and to travel into another country. So I had to show that. So I was a little bit nervous about the border crossing there. It ended up I had no problem. The folks there were just great. So from that border crossing, I headed down through central Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and then finally to Panama. I guess to be more precise, Panama City. I made it to Panama City, Panama, not Florida. Now, just as I had expected, I had very few problems along the way. Now, I did have a flat tire in New Mexico, and I was told later that the road crews there were prone to dropping nails in the road by accident. It wasn't on purpose that they were doing it. And I'm sure that I had a nail in the tire that went through the tube. Now, the tricky thing with this is that the new tubes for the bike were the one thing that Craig didn't have in stock for me when I visited him in Medford. And what he was going to do is he was going to just ship the tubes down to Robin so that when I went through New Mexico, that she would have them there for me. But the problem was that I got the flat the day before the tubes arrived. Now, Craig's theory, and this is what he told me when I visited him, was that if you're prepared, nothing will go wrong. Now, I wasn't prepared, and I didn't have the tubes, and I had something that went wrong. Luckily, I just stumbled upon some people in the area where I had the flat who were super helpful to me, and this just goes to show you that the universe really does take care of you. Ron, the boat mechanic, in Angel Fire, New Mexico, in this tiny little area where there was nothing else around, he came to my rescue that day. Now, not only did he haul my bike to his shop, and his shop was like 30 minutes away, but he sent his brother, and this guy reminded me a lot of Kramer from Seinfeld. He sent his brother to Albuquerque, which was 90 miles away, to pick up a new tube for me. And that was on a Saturday afternoon. The shop in Albuquerque had actually already closed, but they left the tube out for him, and I paid by credit card, and it all worked out. Now, Ron, the boat mechanic, he also loaned me his car for the night so I could get back to the hostel where I was staying. And he just charged me $100 the next day when I went to pick up the bike, and fully intact. Everything was all set. The tire was all fixed, and it was great. So he charges me $100 for that. So it's great. I hope his business is booming, and I hope people listening to this and people I've told that story to have met Ron in the meantime and given him some business. So like I said, yeah, the universe pretty much does take care of you, and that was a great instance of that. The rest of the trip went relatively smoothly. As I was going through Mexico, I did have to stop at each of the border crossings into each state, and there would be policemen there, armed policemen. And my Spanish was terrible. So in my broken Spanish, at every state border crossing, I would tell them, oh yes, I'm studying Spanish with my husband in whatever the next city was, and how much I loved Mexico. I believe that they would not have let me through if they knew that I was going all the way through Mexico and then on to Central America. I know at the time there was some unrest that was happening in the south of Mexico, and I think it would have been their preference that I wasn't traveling through there at all. So that's why I suspect that they would have turned me around, and that's why I had to kind of make up this story that I was traveling with my husband. He was expecting me. I love Mexico, and I'm studying Spanish, and I managed to get through with no problem. Now, another issue I had was in Nicaragua, and I actually got stuck there for a couple of days when peasants shut down the one road, the Pan American Highway, that goes through the country, and they were protesting the government, and they were doing so by stopping all traffic and all services and all goods that were going through. The embassy, because I called the embassy, they couldn't tell me how long the shutdown would last, and the thing for me is that I had a flight out of Panama City a week later. And so I had this sense of urgency to get there. And I still had to make my way through part of Nicaragua, the full length of Costa Rica, which is relatively small, but I still had to get through Costa Rica and then part of Panama and get everything wrapped up in terms of the bike. So this was really scary for me because I had to get through there. This is how it all happened. I was staying in a youth hostel there, and I had heard about this shutdown. The first morning, I took off on the bike, and I had been stopped at this one crossing where the peasants had burning tires and logs across the roadway. And I begged them, please let me through. Please, I can pay you, again, broken Spanish and, the symbol of the local currency there, trying to give that to them. And they wouldn't let me through. So I turned around, I went back to the hostel and just kind of considered my options. And I thought, I don't know how long this shutdown is going to take. I really need to get to Panama. So what am I going to do? So the next day I just thought, well, I'll just be more aggressive about this. I'll be bold. So what I did was I packed up my stuff again the next day. I took off again, got to this same crossing that had been shut down in the roadway, and was begging with them again. They wouldn't let me through. And then, don't you know it, up comes an ambulance, and they opened up the logs that had been blocking the road. They let the ambulance through, and I rode in on the coattails of the ambulance, and they were tugging at the back of my bike trying to get me to stop, but I just kept going. So now that was not the only one on the roadway. So I was able to travel for quite a distance and, got to the next roadblock, and that one was a little bit bigger. I stopped again, begged with the locals, tried to get them to let me through. They would not. There were actually police there, and I was begging with the police, please, can you let me through here? Can you help me out with this? No, we can't. I said, I can pay money for their cause. Again, broken Spanish. I can pay money for their cause. No. We can't let you do that. Absolutely. And this was going to be even tougher because there were police there. So there were no shenanigans on my part to be had. So I turned the bike around and I started to head back to Granada, where the hostel was. And along the way, I passed a couple of guys on one motorbike, on a small motorbike, and I stopped them and I said, no pasa, you can't pass. And they asked me where I was going, and I said, Costa Rica. And they kind of rolled their eyes, and then they said, follow us. They gestured, follow us. So I started following them, and what they did was they circumvented the major road, and we went through farmland, and we went through people's yards and their farms, and, it was with inches of people's homes kind of riding in between. And it had to be 85 degrees, and the sweat is just pouring off of me, and I'm riding in sand and I'm riding in dirt, and I'm just so certain the bike is going to dump over, which it did not, thank goodness. And they got me out to the other side, past the roadblock, onto the highway. They waved me on. I waved them, thank you, and waved them on, and I was back on the highway. And there was not another roadblock after that. I was able to get all the way to Costa Rica from that. So just this incredible good fortune, super lucky that I got there. Now, when I got to the Costa Rican border, no one could believe that I'd actually made it through the highway. They were just sitting around because no one was able to cross the border one way or the other. And here I am going into Costa Rica, and I made it right through. No crossing line, no border line, no nothing. And that was great. So again, good fortune, universe taking care of you, and people just so friendly and so helpful. Now, when I got to Costa Rica, and I was just there for a couple of days, the roads were the worst in all of Central America. And if you've ever driven through Costa Rica, and I know probably a lot of you have because it's common, you fly down there, you get a rental car, the roads are the worst. Got to Panama, the roads were fabulous. And I'm assuming that's because of the U.S. influence at the time and the relative stability of the country. So it was beautiful riding through that my last country that I went through. Now, I loved Panama. Man, I would love to get back there too. And it was in Panama. It was kind of crazy. This is where the motorcycle police would pull me over just because they had never seen a bike like mine. They'd jump back then. They would pull me over. I would take off my helmet and then they'd jump back and they would say, mujer, woman. They couldn't believe it was a woman because underneath all of my gear and my helmet, nobody knew that I was female. And then they were very respectful. They weren't trying to extract any money out of me. They would just check out the bike and then they would let me be on my way. And that was just my delightful experience in Panama. Now, logistically, throughout the trip, I stayed in hostels. I stayed in YMCAs, which often have really inexpensive beds where you can stay. And I think they've got them. I think there are ones that are for male and for female. YMCA obviously has male in the name of it. That worked out well because it was inexpensive. And then I would stay just at cheap hotels. I never camped and I never stayed anywhere by myself because I didn't feel like it was safe. And I was really watchful anytime I stopped on the side of the road to take pictures, especially on the toll road highways, because those were there was very little traffic on it. And the traffic that was there, it was usually truck drivers. And so I just had to really watch it anytime I stopped to take photos. So I was very cautious the entire trip. And I was cautious in terms of who saw me go into hotels and that kind of thing as well. So that's kind of big picture. I could probably, spend an evening with you or, the 2 hours over coffee and tell you lots of stories about that. But that's kind of the backstory with it. And so now, remember, Robin had a question. What I was trying to do was answer many of the questions that come into me via email. So next time I can just direct people to this show. Robin's question was, if I would still ride my motorcycle from Seattle to Panama solo today, would I do that today? And if so, what would I do differently? And if I wouldn't, why not? So to answer that question, Robin, no, I wouldn't do that trip solo today. And I likely wouldn't do it with another person or even in a group. Now, I know some people out there disagree with me in terms of how safe or unsafe Mexico is right now, but I'm just not feeling very confident and not confident as a motorcycle rider trying to go through the country. In 1997, when I did that trip, I could have pretty much gone anywhere in the country. There was a time, maybe, 10 or 20 years prior to that, when many people considered it unsafe to travel through Mexico. And, honestly, I don't know if that was ignorance or prejudice. I just really don't know. But I feel like I traveled through the country at a time when things were stable and you didn't hear much, if anything, about things happening to tourists. And I felt good mapping my route based on what was most interesting and expeditious for me. I didn't have safety concerns at that point. Now, if a person were to do that trip, I think you'd need to spend a lot of time on mapping and figuring out the safest route through the country because I just don't know where that is. It could be there. I just don't know. Look, I love Mexico. And I have traveled there many times since that motorcycle trip and actually just several times in the past few years. But I think that even the staunchest of supporters of travel to Mexico wouldn't disagree with me that the fact of a woman traveling on a motorcycle solo could run into far more issues today than 20 years ago. I just think that that's a fact. And things happen to men, things happen to women. There. And I'm talking about tourists and I'm talking about motorcycle riders specifically. I just wouldn't do it. So is it possible? Absolutely. And far be it from me to stop anyone from doing something adventurous because I'm all about going for it. And I do believe that anything's possible. But would I do it right now? Nope. I just wouldn't do it. If you do want to read a bit about that ride, I've actually written about it. I've written about it in several places, but the easiest place for you to find it right now is wanderlustandlipstick.com/motorcycle. And there's a partial story in there that I wrote about that trip. Okay, next question. This one is unrelated to travel, and it's a really sweet question from Patty. She says, I admire you because of your politeness and generosity and how you treat everybody. Any advice on how not to engage in negative conversations or how to deal with clients that are rude? Patty, that is really kind of you. As a side note, she's seen me in action as she traveled with me in India late last year. And that is one place where it's difficult to be polite and generous. So I'm glad that I came off as both of those on that tour because it's not always easy. And I will say too that I'm not always polite and generous. And sometimes I do engage in negative conversation. So luckily, those negative conversations often take place in my head as I try to limit what comes out of my mouth. The exception being customer service calls with cell phone companies and, internet providers. And all bets are off at that point. I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. So sorry to any customer service folks out there that have been on the receiving end of my Jersey mouth. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I'll say that what Patty observed in me likely comes from a few different places. First, my mom always taught me to kill people with kindness. She was a really sweet woman for sure. And even behind the scenes at home, she mostly kept her cool. It's probably because she never had to deal with cell phone companies or internet providers. But when she was mad about work or at neighbors, she kept it in. So I probably have a little bit of that. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily healthy to keep that stuff in, but it's what I observed growing up, and I'm sure it's influenced me in some way. But there are a couple other things that are going on for me. So I credit studying Buddhism and my meditation practice as playing a big role in how I respond to things. I've learned to take a moment before reacting to, or really more importantly, responding to things. So, of course, I am human and I'm like everybody else. I get flustered and I get angry, but I have learned over time to not get too emotional about things. I still get emotional sometimes, but I try not to get too emotional about things. So as far as tours go, like, what Patty observed, I know that people on my tours are watching me to be the leader. And if I'm in a situation where things are going sideways, if I'm saying, oh crap, I don't let others know that. I keep it inside because they'll take that as a cue and they will be thinking the same thing and they'll be even more worried. Now, I happen to know that things will always work out. So if I can just stay calm, even if it's just on the outside, and if I'm not feeling it myself, I'm not feeling it on the inside, if I can stay calm on the outside and I can get past that moment, then I can stay calm and I can problem solve my way out of the issue. It never fails. I just have to have the faith that things will work out. And when you have that faith, then they do work out. So she mentioned generous, and I actually don't know if she means generous of spirit or literally generous. Now, it's far easier for me to be generous of spirit, but I struggle with literally being generous because I'm a cheapskate and fully admit it. And because of that, I'm always looking for ways I can be generous because I'm aware that I'm cheap. So I think, okay, are you being cheap or are you being practical here or what's the story? So I'm always questioning myself in terms of that. And I think, will I look back on this moment and regret that I didn't buy coffee for the person in line in front of me who forgot her wallet? Or I don't know, will I regret not having picked up a gift for someone when I saw it, even if their birthday is 6 months away, that kind of thing. So I'm always kind of wondering the small amount of money that I'm going to pay for this, how much is that going to improve or affect someone's life? And that's the way I try to look at it. Now, by the way, my mom was also really cheap, mostly because we had very little when I was growing up. We had very little extra money. So I guess that's another trait that I picked up from her. Would I say that she's generous? She did a lot of things for people, but it didn't involve money. So I think she was generous of spirit as well. So finally, Patty also asked for advice on how not to engage in negative conversation. And it's really difficult to train yourself to not do this. Now, I had a job once where a coworker and I constantly complained to each other. And it was our way of commiserating about the terrible work environment we were in. And really, I think it helped us feel like we weren't in it alone. We had a common enemy. But it also reinforced how terrible the situation was. And I'm sure that it made us both even more unhappy because we were constantly talking about it and complaining about it. Now, I left that job about, 11 years ago. And I think that's when I left those kinds of conversations behind me as well. I was aware of how unhealthy it was for me, that constant complaining and commiserating. So I would say to Patty, I don't know, here's maybe a little trick that you can do. Think of a person in your life that is the complainer. And that's been me in the past, so it's okay. We all have them, and sometimes we are one. So someone who comes to mind, and they just come to you so that they can moan and tell you unhappy that they are. And we all know someone like that. And then I'd say, think of someone where the relationship is more constructive, a different person. And it might be someone who, shares frustrations with you, but in a healthier way, somebody who's really seeking genuine advice. And it can be totally fun to complain and dish on a mutual enemy, but how do you feel after those encounters? So how do you feel after, you're talking to someone that you're just complaining really for complaining sake? There's no constructive outcome there. And then how do you feel when you're talking with someone who comes to you and is asking for constructive feedback? So you usually feel pretty good after that second one, and you feel pretty lousy after that first one. So then you start to look at your relationships and you start to wonder what you're getting out of that relationship with the person that you're either complaining to, or you're listening to their complaints, or you're mutually commiserating. I would suggest that you change the relationship with the person or the people where it's more toxic. And if you stop being the complainer, people will stop coming to you with their complaints. And that is the truth. Now, in Buddhism, we're taught the idea of right speech. In other words, you're taught not to gossip and not to speak ill of others. So when I think about that a lot, and when I do talk about others, or even when I think about others, it's usually, and I say usually with an emphasis, it's in a constructive, problem-solving manner. I try not to be overly negative or think overly negative thoughts. And sometimes I'm very aware of it. And I just try to say, well, what if this person was like this other way? And I try to look at them that way. And myself too. Instead of giving myself a hard time and talking negatively about myself, I try to switch that around. It can go that way as well. So I think for the most part, I've stopped being that person who complains. So people don't try to engage with me in terms of gossip. And I know you know what I mean, because there are people in your life that don't put up with that, and you can't go complain to them. So I think it's really great to try to be that person, especially in the environment that we live in today. So just give that some thought. I will say one thing as I just kind of wrap up this question with Patty. I love Patty. She is hilarious. She's outrageous, and she's just amazing. And she's also generous, and she says things out loud that I just couldn't. And so, and I don't know, she might be referring to some of those things about herself, about not being rude to other people, but it's the part of her that I love. So I do think that there's a place for that. As long as you're not hurting someone, there is a place for, being bold with your words for sure. And I hope some of you get to meet Patty. Some of you I know already have met her, but I do hope that more people listening to this get to meet Patty, because she is just an absolute hoot. So now I want to go right into Janice's question, because this makes a nice bridge here. She would like to know about my meditation practice, and specifically how old I was when I started, how consistent I am. Have I ever stopped for long periods and then started again? Do I meditate in silence, or do I use a guided meditation? Basically, she said she wants to know everything. So I'll try to answer those questions for you. Maybe not everything, but I'll answer those questions. So I started about 12 years ago after a trip to India. And what happened was John and I traveled over there, and we stayed with my friend's parents in Pune. And I think I was 40 at the time. That would have made me. So we stayed with my friend's parents, and it was a lovely visit, and they are just super nice people. And about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, my friend's mom stepped out of the room, and she went into another room, and then I could hear her chanting. And I asked the husband, is she meditating, or is she chanting? Yes, she is. She's meditating. And I thought it was really interesting that she had absolutely no inhibition, no shame about the fact that she was just stepping away and going to meditate, and she was spending her time doing her prayers and her chants, her puja, as they call it in India. And then she came back and she joined us for the rest of the evening. And she did this in the morning and in the afternoon. And I thought, this is just a part of her life that's just woven in. And it's not, she doesn't have to go to church for it. She doesn't have to leave the house and be with a big group of people. This is just her way of being at peace. And I thought that was so beautiful. So when I came home from that India trip, I started meditating fairly regularly. And I had probably tried it, on and off over the years, but I just thought, yeah, I can incorporate this into my life. I did not have the knowledge back then that I do now, though. So I was just sitting and meditating, not really having a plan, not really knowing what I'm doing. Now, I had been reading a lot of books on Buddhism, and that's probably been for the last 30 years or so. I think it started with my travels to Asia. And here in Seattle, John and I started attending a Buddhist temple, and we'd go every Monday night. And as part of that, we did 2 meditations every night and a Dharma talk in between. So it started with a meditation. There was a Dharma talk by a wonderful teacher, and then a meditation at the end. And so that kind of Monday night, that kind of started me on my weekly path. Like, that was a great start to the week. And then for the rest of the week, I'd have a way to kind of step into meditation for the rest of the week. And I began noticing a difference in my behavior. I was more relaxed. I wasn't as quick to get angry. I really became more mellow in a very good way because I wasn't reacting to things. Now, I wasn't meditating every single day. I just started noticing that as I brought it into a regular practice, even just a few times a week, it was having an effect on me. And when you realize that something's good for you and it's having a positive effect on you, then you just keep doing it. And so it made me want to do it more because I could tell the difference, and it just became so important to me. Now, there's definitely times that I fall off the wagon and I stop, but it's usually not for a really long stretch of time. It's not for months. It might be a couple of weeks here and there. And because I can really tell the difference, I owe it to myself and the people around me to get back on the wagon and keep meditating, because really I think I treat people better when I am on a regular meditation practice. So it is difficult when I'm traveling. at least mainly when I'm on a tour because I'm very busy. So it is more difficult for me to meditate regularly when I'm on a tour. And the only time, it's not the only time that I can, but the time that I'm assured that I can is when I'm in flight, because I use that takeoff time and I use the landing time kind of as my cues to meditate for maybe 20 minutes or so. Now I have an altar at home, and this is often, where I sit to meditate. And what happens is I get up in the morning, go to the bathroom, brush my teeth, and then I walk out and I pass the altar on the way to go downstairs. So it's a nice little place I can just drop in. It's very obvious. It's very easy for me to do. Sometimes I'll just go downstairs, or I'll just sit by the window and I'll look out at Mount Rainier or the mountains, and I'll just use that time to meditate, and I'll just sit and kind of do a formal practice without the altar or the incense. Now, sometimes I quote unquote cheat and I lay in bed before I even get up for the day. And what I'll do is I'll put on a timer on my phone, or I'll do a guided meditation. And that actually brings me to another part of Janice's question, and that is, do I meditate in silence or is it guided? Now, it's mostly silent meditation that I do. I use an app called Insight Timer, and boy, this has some really lovely gongs and bells that I use, and it's got a wide variety, so there's something for everyone on there. And what I do is I set the timer for 20 minutes, and then I have it ring, kind of gong, every 5 minutes. Because if I don't do that, I'm constantly checking the timer because I feel like I know it's got to have been 18 minutes by now. And really, it's only like 4 minutes. So if I can set it for every 5 minutes or so, then I don't have to keep looking at it. I just know that 5-minute mark is coming up. So generally, I focus on my breath, but I also focus on phrases. And what I'll do is I'll breathe in things that I want, and I say these kind of to myself. I say something like peace, calm, relax, and that's on the breath in. And then when I breathe out things that I want to get rid of, such as anger and judgment. Now, that's just me. It's kind of a made-up thing that I do. There are a gazillion ways to meditate, and there's really no right way to do it. It's all about calming your mind and being aware of your thoughts. And, a lot of people say to me, oh, I can't meditate because my mind just keeps going. But that is the point. The point is to be aware of those thoughts in your mind, because most of the day, whether you realize it or not, you're talking to yourself, and you don't realize how negative those thoughts are and how much harm they're doing, because they're just reinforcing things. If you become aware of them, you can stop them before they really start spinning out of control. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, we just spin stories and we don't even know, we spin stories about other people and we don't even know their side of the story. If you're aware and you're honest with yourself, you'll realize that we are constantly having conversations with people who aren't there. And, to go back to how I answered Patty's question, that's what I try to stop, the talking, the internal talking to myself and to other people who aren't there. And I've become much more aware of that. And even though it sounds really cliche, I try to stay present and in the moment so I'm not making stuff up that isn't happening. And that's what meditation does for me. It just helps me kind of give that pause. Now, I'll add that sometimes I do like a guided meditation, or I like to listen to music or to chants, and that you'll find all of that on the Insight Timer app. Now, another great exercise for people is to do a body scan. And it's actually a great way to get into meditation because it makes you realize how much there is to notice. Now, body scan is where, you're laying still or you're sitting and you're going maybe from the top of your head down to your forehead, down to your face, all the elements of your face, your neck, and you're just feeling everything as you go from top to bottom or bottom to top. And it's just making you aware of your body. And it's a really wonderful way just to kind of stay present and in yourself. So, hey, actually anyone interested in meditation, I highly recommend Dan Harris's podcast. It's called 10% Happier. And nearly all of his guests are meditators. So that's kind of how he frames the entire conversation as, how did you get started meditating? And everybody has a different angle on it. And Dan is really knowledgeable. So he gets, he asks great questions and shares wonderful information. Okay, so that's meditation. And I want to answer one more question. And even though I had so many more, I'm just going to answer one more, and I'll come back to those other questions on another episode. So this one's great. This one specifically has to do with travel. And Jane asked if I ever regretted a trip. Have I ever regretted a trip? That's a really interesting question. Now, I first want to say that there's only one thing I've really regretted in my entire life. Had nothing to do with travel. It was when we were headed to a surprise 50th birthday party for our friend Todd, and Todd was dying of cancer. We had left the house and we were about 5 minutes away. We're headed over the West Seattle Bridge, so there was no place to turn around. And I realized I had forgotten my camera. And I had wanted to take a bunch of photos. This was cell phone where everybody's got the smartphone where everybody's got a camera on their phone. So I was bringing a camera, and I had wanted to take a bunch of photos and give them to him and to his family in an album. And we didn't turn around to get the camera because we wanted to make sure that we got to the house in time for the surprise. And at the time, I don't know, I should have turned around to get the camera because I would have had those photos of Todd, because he died, not too long after that. And that was a long time ago, and I still think about that, and it still just really breaks my heart. So that's like my one life regret, which is crazy. Maybe it's not so crazy, but it's the one thing that I hold on to and always remember. In general, I'm not one to regret things because I know things. I don't believe that things happen for a reason, but I believe that things happen and then other things happen. And as a result, it all works out. So I don't ever want to go back and change things. So having said that, in terms of travel, I don't think I've ever thought back on a trip and actually regretted it. Now, there have been times when just before a trip, I freak out and I wonder why I planned or scheduled a trip at a certain time, because things just get so crazy. And I think, what have I done planning this trip now? I can't go away now. But then once I'm on the way to the airport, I've totally calmed down, and I realize that when I think I can't go away, that's exactly when I need to go away. And you know what? As I'm talking this out, I will tell you that I just booked flights to New Jersey, and I come back from the Santa Fe culinary tour on a Monday, and I leave on Tuesday for New Jersey for about a week. And that is not ideal for me. Things always seem like a great idea ahead of time, and then when the time comes here, I'm sure that I'm going to be freaking out on that, that day before I have to leave and get everything together to take off for New Jersey. So that's just an example. Now, I do look back on trips and I think I should have taken advantage of that activity or paid money to see or do that thing when I was there. But sometimes I'm so cheap, I don't just do everything that I could or should do. And I've learned over the years from those experiences that I've passed by and later thought, I probably should have done that. So I do try to do more, and I try to take advantage of things the first time around, the first time I'm at a destination. So big picture, no, I've never regretted a trip. Smaller picture, yeah, sometimes I look back and I think that I should have done things on a trip that I didn't do. So that answers your question, Jane. So, okay. That was just a few of the many questions that I received, and with the risk of going on way too long here, which I don't want to do, I'm going to wrap this up. I've got some great questions that are in the pipeline. And I encourage you, if you've got questions for me, there's a contact form on the BeBoldPodcast.com website that you can send me additional questions. You can find me on social media and send me a note there as well, and I'll add you to the queue for that. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question on this go-around, but I will save it for next time. So, okay. If you have made it this far through the episode, please don't stop. If you enjoyed it, please share this and the podcast in general with anyone whom you think might enjoy it. And I can't stress enough that word of mouth is so important in helping to get more listeners to the podcast. Please subscribe. That helps. When you subscribe, you're telling your podcast provider that you like the show, and that helps it get more visibility when people are searching for topics, and I'd really appreciate it. There's a lot of competition out there these days for podcasts, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. So please take that extra step to ensure you're receiving all of the episodes, and it's free. Isn't that cool? Don't forget to check out my tours at wandertours.com. If you'd like to connect with me, you can friend me on Facebook, and I am WanderGal on Instagram. You can find out more about me by visiting wanderlustandlipstick.com. Sign up for my newsletter on the Wanderlust and Lipstick site, and you'll receive a series of tips for making your travels safer. Ladies, you can join us on our Be Bold Facebook group. We've got lots of members in there, I think about 2,600 right now. It's a community of amazing women who are sharing their wins and sometimes their struggles. We learn from each other, we share information, and most importantly, we give each other high fives and encouragement along the way. So thanks for joining me for another episode of the Be Bold podcast. And until next time, be bold.